Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of the day. I will, both for my behalf and for everyone else's, reiterate our gratitude to Hani Rashwan, Rebecca Gold, and Bilal Orfali, as well as Abdurrahim Abul Hussein, for putting together this wonderful group together. And for giving us a chance to have a sustained conversation over today and hopefully the next day as well on post-Eurocentric poetics with reflections deriving from Arabic, Persian, and Turkish literary heritages. So I will introduce each speaker in turn, and I will follow the order that is listed in your program. Our first presenter today is Ferenc Sirkes. He teaches at Sabancı University in Istanbul, and his presentation today is entitled Translating One's Own Style, the Fresh Style in Safavid Persian and Turkic Poetry.
All right, thanks very much, and thanks again for to the organizers for having me here. I hope I can keep my face next to this microphone. And so this paper has a much larger project about Turkic and Turkish literature in Safavid Iran, or more appropriately, the politics of language in the early modern Persianate context. In fact, it was a very small dot in my dissertation. Now I'm enlarging this dot, but actually this is still a work in progress, so I really will appreciate all your comments that you might have. So it's well known that the Safavids came to power at the head of a larger Turcophone tribal military following known as the Kızılbaş. It's also well known that under their tenure between 1501 and 1722, Iran converted to Shiism, and that they gave lavish patronage to the arts, including Persian literature and architecture, as well as Shiite religious learning. It is much less known and certainly less well studied that during the entire lifespan of the Safavid dynasty, Turkic as a literary language in Iran had a constant presence, albeit the patronage received varied depending on time and place. Indeed, and perhaps this is the only somewhat better known aspect of Turkic literature in Iran, the founder of the Safavid dynasty himself, Shah Ismail I, was a well-known Turkic poet, some of whose popular messianic poetry, along with the poetry produced by popular religious enthusiasts in his wake, has continued to be revered among antinomian religious groups. Discussing the relation between Turkic and Persian as poetic languages in the Persianate context, today I will concentrate on how the Tazegui, the fresh style, misnomered in scholarship as the so-called Indian style, dominant in Persian and Ottoman poetry in the 17th and 18th centuries, featured in the works of a number of poets in Safavid Iran who wrote in both Persian and Turkic. I analyze whether certain poems written in Turkic by such outstanding poets of the 17th century in Persian as Sahib Tabrizi, Vahid Ghazvini, Voiz Ghazvini, or Murtaza Khuli Khan Shamlu. Actually, we're going to have only time for Sahib. So we'll see how whether they go back to or can be derived from Persian models, or whether they are their work are paraphrases naziras to Turkic poems, particularly by Fuzuli, a paradigmatic Turkish poet of the 16th century. In other words, did the aforesaid Safavid poets recycle or recast some of their Persian poetry or that of other poets? Or did they look to Turkic models? The question is particularly interesting as each of these Safavid poets wrote most of their works in Persian, the language of choice in Safavid Iran, and only on occasion in Turkic. Aside from Persian, the Turkic literary tradition also had a continuous presence in Iran, though the practices of Tazegui and Safavid Turkic poetry seem much more sporadic than either in Persian or in Ottoman Turkish. Most probably because the heavily intellectualizing, artistic Tazegui was written for a more urban, so-called middle-class audience, which was Persophone in Iran, whereas Turkic poets tended to follow the poetics of the previous Timurid Turkmen period. On one hand, I attempt to transcend modern nationalist Orientalist narratives about originality and influence, which assign an inferior position to the receiving culture in a cultural exchange. In this case, Turkic following Persian poetics. On the other hand, I also take issues with nationalist paradigms that tend to disregard the relationship between the prestigious Persian literary tradition and Turkic coming in its wake. On a more general level, therefore, I will chart venues as to how to conceptualize the history of a Turkic literary tradition in Iran, and more broadly, the relationship between vernaculars and quote-unquote classical literary idioms in a Persianate context. Before doing that, two concepts need to be highlighted. The first is Nazira, that already Rebecca has touched upon, which is a parallel poem or poetic paraphrase, indeed a special form of poetic imitatio. Up until recently, the poetics of imitation, or the writing of poetic imitation, was subject in modern Orientalist and nationalist scholarship to rejection, as the sign of the lack of creative talent, based on the premise that the past literary tradition influences the present in a one-sided fashion. Scholars of Persian literature, however, have recently started to appreciate imitation more, largely in the wake of Paul Lozensky, who himself, partly in the wake of Thomas Green's work on European Renaissance poetry, convincingly claims just the opposite, saying that imitation is a conscious, purposive, and creative reflection on the literary past. Accordingly, and as analyzed by Lozensky in his groundbreaking study, paraphrasing or imitating, the practice of what is referred to as jawab, response poem, nazire, parallel or counter poem, or istiqbal, welcoming poem, in the sources, so this has obviously a playful edge to it. The poet composes a new poem, keeping the rhyme, meter, and often the main motive or theme of at least the first verse of the poem he wishes to paraphrase. By doing so, he points at the poem he is paraphrasing, and at the same time he shows off his attempt to outdo it. The dialogue and tension between the model and the paraphrase, that is the tradition, and the new poem, is essential to the poetic effect. In other words, the poet evokes the tradition he paraphrases, and he also puts his own skills on display at the same time. It is thus a statement about the paraphrasing poet's aesthetic values and poetic power, as well as the poetic tradition. Paraphrasing was also a communal exercise, serving communal entertaining or homiletic purposes, at, for example, gatherings of literati and the Shah's or Kızılbaş Emir's court, or in a Sufi community. The paraphrasing poet assumes that his audience is aware of the poem he is paraphrasing. The effect of his paraphrase is thus greatly depending on that. Paraphrasing is thus highly context and audience bound. The choice of the model is a conscious act on the part of the paraphrasing poet, and he also has to make sure that his audience knows what he is paraphrasing. The other term is the aforesaid fresh style, some features of which can be, of course, found in poetry written before the Safavid period. But it is this period when they become prominent. In the poetry of such poets during the 17th, 18th centuries as Saeb, Kalime Kashani, Hazin Laheji, Bidel, etc., poetry assumes a heavily intellectualizing, reflexive mode that can be briefly summarized as mazmun pardazi, or playing around with poetic images and conceits. The fresh style poet thus searches for novelty, abstractness, and surprise of imagery, and he is prone to coin new phrases or employ the language of the street. He searches for new connections between poetic elements, often resulting in the challenging recherché images and grammatical constructions. In addition, freestyle poetry is marked by the practice of what is usually termed as muadele-sazi, or poetic equilibrium, which means that the poet says something in the first hemistich, half line, of a couplet, which he repeats in the second hemistich in a greatly different way, leaving in the reader or listener the impression of a disconnect, on first glance at least. Born in Tabriz, likely in 1592, and dying in Isfahan in 1676, Saab was probably the most prolific and most popular poet of the Persianate world in the 17th century, from Mughal India to the Ottoman Empire and, of course, Safavid Iran. The standard edition of his divan contains over 7,000 ghazals. It's less known that he also produced a handful of ghazals in the dialect of his native Tabriz. As I've intimated before, we should not be surprised that he wrote these poems. Although the Turkmen Kızılbaş element was politically marginalized from the early 17th century onwards, due to the centralizing reforms of Abbas I, and consequently there was probably less patronage available for writing in Turkic, bilingualism was widespread and the dynasty itself was Turcophone. Therefore, Turkic literary practices remained part of popular culture. Bilingual poets like Saeb were thus in a perfect position to transfer the new style, the Shive-i Taze, to a Turcophone audience, even only on a limited scale. Thanks to the work carried out by Azerbaijani scholars like Pasha Kerimov, we know much more about the process. So, let's see a poem by Saeb in Turkic. Here is the first couplet, and I will get more into the details. So, let me read just the first line in Turkish too. Tutulmuş gönlümü cam ile şadan eylemek olmaz. El ile pestenin ağzını handan eylemek olmaz. So it's possible to make my captivated heart happy. It's impossible to make my captive heart happy with the goblet. It's impossible to make the mouth of the pistachio laugh with the hand. So, this is a paraphrase of Nazire on the following very well-known Fuzuli poem. Gönülde bir gamın vardır ki pinhan eylemek olmaz. Bu hem bir gam ki iltanından efgan eylemek olmaz. I have 1,000 afflictions in my heart which are impossible to hide. This is such a pain that it's impossible to complain about people's rebuke. So let's see in detail the Fuzuli Ghazal. I don't think I should read out the Turkish entirety. So, Fuzuli focuses on the paradox of mystical love. Let me read out at least part of the English. So, here is how it continues. Whatever pain or sorrow there is, you can find its remedy in the world. How much of a pain and sorrow your love is that there is no remedy for it. Heart, do not struggle too much to set out to the country of death. You cannot stop the pain of separation in this way. Oh, advisor or friend, do not start giving me advice. You are wrecking my heart. It's impossible to destroy a country through the desire of the carnal soul. The heart wanted your ruby lips on your mouth. It would be tough to reject it. It seems to have no crime. Blood should not be shed over something that doesn't exist. I pray so much that he will never come by again. What can I do? But you cannot make me a cypress. You cannot make a cypress walk with magic. Fuzuli, do not brag about your love while you are captivated by this world. It's impossible to claim to be possessed of gnosis in perfect ignorance. So, Fuzuli's poem focuses on the paradox of mystical love. and the abandonment of the self. Beit 4 talks about the pain of the mystical path and the social estrangement rebuke it entails, confirmed by the rhyming of Penhan and Efgon, and the partial repetition of the first half of the first hemistich in the second hemistich. So, yeah. So gönülde bir gamım var, and bu hem bir gam ki. So, also using a lot of repetition, nemüşkil derman, beit, derman. Beit 2 contrasts mundane problems, which always have a solution, with mystical love, which doesn't. Verse 3 claims that not even death can stop the mystic's pain over his separation from God, especially because it is this very pain that the mystic wants. Verse 4 brings in the allegorical companion, an advisor, who gives mundane advice about how to reach his beloved, which the speaker rejects, for he cannot want anything, because such wishes belong to the carnal soul. In verse 5, the lover wants the ruby-like red lips of the beloved. Okay. That is mystical union. As per the paradox, this mysticism, this wish cannot be rejected, for that will kill the lover, but granting it will also destroy him. The paradox is emphasized by the color symbolism of the verse, the ruby lips of the beloved and blood. Verse 6 says that piety, in this case constant prayer, which according to the speaker, is like magic or the carnal self, in that it wants to reach the beloved instead of giving up the self for the beloved. Finally, verse 7 claims that mundane entanglements and mystical knowledge are incompatible. The poem has returned to the motif of the necessity of remaining silent. As is appropriate for the Nazira, here is Saeb's poem. So as it's appropriate for a Nazira, Saeb's poem evokes Fuzuli's poem, but he uses the model for very different purposes. Saeb's poem hinges on the connection between the individual hemistiches. The first half line of verse 1 also, so here is the first line, it's impossible to make my captivated heart happy with the goblet. It's impossible to make the mouth of the pistachio open up laughing with the hand. So this first half line talks about how much pain mystical love brings, just like Fuzuli. However, while Fuzuli talks about the pain of separation from the beloved and its possible social consequences, such as social alienation, Saeb gives the mazmoon, or the conceit, an ironic turn. Not even wine, that is the allegory of mystical union, can make his heart happy. Adding to the playful character of the verse, is it 3 minutes? 3 minutes, okay. And we might add, following the fresh style with its sociolinguistic innovations, the second hemistich brings in what seems to be a popular saying. One can open a pistachio but cannot make it laugh. The parallel between the description of the mystical pain and the profane act of breaking a pistachio, driven further by the otherwise stereotypical rhyming of chardon and chandon, as well as by the similar shape of the mouth of the goblet and the mouth we find in the second hemistich, reflects an ethos very different from what we find in Fuzuli's corresponding first beit. So I will skip details of this poem and try to jump to conclusion. So this analysis tried to suggest that Saeb produced in Turkic a poem that has the full poetic armory, usually associated with the Shive Taze. Interestingly, however, while he puts this style on full display, he references the pantheon of his Kızılbaş Turkmen readers or listeners, or perhaps those at the Mughal court, for we have no way of dating this poem. That is, he doesn't, quote-unquote, translate from Persian, but uses, reflects on the tradition that was better known for his Turkish audience. The freestyle poems of Saeb and other poets in Turkic also give us a glimpse of the process of cultural translation. Instead of reaching for Persian models in his Turkic naziras, Saeb paraphrases poems that likely appeal to his Turcophone audience. As has been indicated before, a nazira only works well if the audience is aware of its model and can thus appreciate the poet's creative modifications. Saeb wanted his audience to have something familiar to which they could compare what he had to offer to them. Of course, this doesn't mean that he conceived of conceits, mazmuz, that were not present in his Persian poetry or that of others. Indeed, the conceits and images are very much familiar from Persian freestyle poetry. Why did these poets, and in particular Saeb, write in Turkic at all? First, there was a constant, if peripheral, interest for it at the court. Further, we should not exaggerate bilingualism in pre-modern Iran. Or rather, we should qualify what we mean by it. Understanding the freestyle with its intricate, sometimes intentionally obscure conceits and images necessitated not only strong skills in Persian, but also a highly literate familiarity with its poetic tradition. Nevertheless, it's probably better to look at these Turkic poems by Saeb as experiments, a trait that was highly characteristic of his Persian poetry as well. There was simply an incomparably large urban audience for Persian, a literary language with a much more crystallized and extensive canon, paraphrasing which appealed to poets like Saeb so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferenc. Our second presenter today comes to us from Germany, Kristen Kempfe, who is at the Philipps-Universität of Marburg. And her presentation is titled, Not Just Another Hamza, Dynamics of Transmission in Medieval Persian Literature.
So, thanks for the introduction. I am going to present today a part of my PhD thesis. And what I'm presenting right here is basically the result of people telling me to change my topic, because no one would be interested in medieval Persian literature anymore. And my thesis was intended to be a close read of the romantic epic Humayun Humayun, written by Hojo Kermani in the 14th century. But after people telling me that Persian literature would be a dying field, I tried to take another approach at the whole topic, and this is what came out. It's still quite very experimental, and I'm thankful for any comments. Okay. In 1819, the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe published his poetry collection, West Eastern Divan, a collection that was inspired by the Divan of Hafez. Goethe himself highly admired Persian literature, and it was him who introduced the concept of Weltliteratur, world literature, to the world of literary studies. But for the study of Persian literature, it became until today an obstacle. Researchers access Persian literature by focusing on individual authors and works, looking for valuable writings that could be integrated into the canon of world literature. Therefore, they extracted the works from their historical and literary context, what made a deeper comprehension of this literature and its dynamics impossible. Furthermore, poets whose works seemed to be of lower value ended up in the second row, being not more than an object to comparison with authors like Ferdowsi and Nizami. In the late 19th and early 20th century, several attempts were being made to organize and evaluate Persian literature by means of Western theories and methods, like dividing literary history into periods and genres. The most famous approach here is the Sabk-Shenosi of Muhammad Taqi Bahar. But by now, all of these approaches have been proved to be insufficient, and medieval Persian literature still has a very static look. In addition to that, epic poetry after Nizami is still being seen as epigonic and ahistorical, lacking innovation and movement. It is obvious that we need a new approach to study pre-modern Persian literature in order to give each phenomenon its unique place in literary history and to re-evaluate literary artistry. We need to get rid of the boundaries of periods and genres and change from a close to a distant reading, focusing more on dynamics of development than on the text. We have to start looking at the Persian literary tradition of the Middle Ages as one tradition that has its own dynamics for both self-preservation and transmission. This includes having a closer look at phenomena that we take for granted. One of these phenomena is literary imitation, and one of the phenomena that is connected to literary imitation I will present today. I have divided the presentation into 4 parts. I will shortly talk about literary imitation in medieval Persian literature, then about the Hamse Nevisi, followed by Hajuk Kermani's epic Humayun, and the conclusion. Literary imitation, sarika, or I prefer the Persian spelling actually, sergat, is a common feature of pre-Islamic literatures. It has been mentioned before that the sergat deals primarily with the plagiarism of a single line, less with plagiarism of larger parts or whole epics. Because of that, we can apply the theoretical framework of sarika, maybe for lyrical poetry, but for epics, we need a different approach. Studies on ghazal poetry have introduced the term istiqbal as a form of textual adaptation. The main difference between sarika and istiqbal is mainly the relation between author and text. Whereas the sarika is based on the relationship between author and a corpus of poetic themes and topoi, the istiqbal is based on the relationship between two authors. And where the sarika gives the text in an ahistorical shape, the istiqbal opens a gap between two texts by adapting it to the contemporary audience. A point that is valid for sarika as well as for istiqbal is that themes and topoi, the so-called ma'na, were seen as common property, so-called loci communes. Every author was allowed to adapt a ma'na, but it was always attributed to the first author who used it until a successor developed it more skillfully. Now, looking at Persian epic poetry, the question is if we can use the concept of istiqbal also for the imitation of epics. Speaking of literary imitation in medieval Persia, we have to take a closer look at a concept that is distinctive Persian and that plays a significant role in the transmission of literary tradition, the Hamsa poetry, or Hamse Nevisi. So, what is a Hamsa? A Hamsa is a set of 5 narrative epics. The first Hamsa was written by Nizami, whose 5 epics were denoted as a Hamsa after his death. The criterion was their brilliance and their uniqueness. It should be mentioned at this point that some critics perceived his Hamsa as a sitta because of the Iskandar Name being divided into Ekbal Name and Sharaf Name. Nizami's Hamsa became the prototype and set the standard for imagery and meters. But the originator of the Hamse Nevisi, or Hamse Sarai, was Amir Khosrow, who imitated Nizami's Hamse in order to establish himself as a poet. Amir Khosrow follows Nizami's pattern He rewrites the epics and uses the same meters. Then 1 century later, in the 14th century, Hojo Kermani composes his own Khamsa, and Jamali and Jami following in the 15th century, and eventually a chain of Khamsas was created, as you may see in the presentation. But to understand the dynamics that the Khamsa Nivisi created, we need to have a closer look at Nizami's Khamsa to explain why it became a model for imitation. Firstly, he unites the 3 manifestations of epic poetry: wisdom poetry, heroic poetry, and romantic poetry. Secondly, and this point has not been highlighted yet, he also combines the literary traditions that shaped Persian literature up to the 12th century. Mahzan al-Azrar continues the tradition of wisdom literature and the tradition of Sana'i. Khosrow Shirin was taken from the Shahnameh, but there are also close connections to Gorgani's Vizoramin, what puts his epic into the tradition of the first Persian epics and the so-called Persian Renaissance. The same for Layli and Majnun, since it is a story that belongs to the Osre genre. He connects it to Varre Gol Shah and Vamego Asra. Also, the plots of Haf Pekar and the Iskandarnameh are adapted from the Shahnameh and contain therefore an element of heroic epics connected to romance and philosophical literature in the tradition of Aristotle. By imitating this pattern of Khamsas, this chain of Khamsas, the Khamsa authors built via Nizami a connection to the Shahnameh and the first Persian epics. The value of the literary past was reaffirmed, accepted, and improved. But as you see in the table, the Khamsa of Hojo Kermani does not fit into the chain of Khamsas because he breaks with the tradition of imitation. It would be very interesting to have a look at the Khamsa as a whole, but that would be too huge for this workshop. This is why we'll only have a look at his most famous epic, Humayun Humayun. Hojo wrote his romantic epic, Humayun Humayun, in the year 1331, and it is the first epic of his Khamsa. Hojo himself was a court poet, but also a murshid and follower of the mystic Alauddin Semnani, and this parallel between court and mysticism is obvious in his works. Humayun Humayun is the story of the Syrian prince Humayun, who, after seeing a picture of Humayun, the daughter of the Chinese emperor, sets out on a journey to find her. Besides its adventurous character, the tale also contains strong mystic overtones, and Humayun's journey to his beloved can be understood as the journey of the mystic seeker towards God. Scholars have mostly viewed it as an imitation of Nizami's Khosrow Shirin, but Hojo's epic is more than that, and it gives the Khamsa Nivisi a new direction, as you will see now. Although both epics depict a love story, they contain several striking differences. First, it is the meter. Nizami wrote his epic in the Hazash meter, whereas Hojo chose Mutaqarib. The source of Khosrow Shirin is the Shahnameh, although Nizami does not say it clearly. The source of Humayun Humayun is not clear. The story seems to be taken from a folk tale, and Hojo himself claims that it had been told to him by a fairy in a dream. Nizami sets the plot of his epic mainly in Iran, but Hojo's epic is set in Syria, some exotic islands, and China, therefore out of the Persian heartland. Also, the characterization of the heroes differ, since Khosrow is presented as a king with a somewhat confused identity, and Humayun is similar to Ramin, a love-struck prince who is also a musician. Humayun Humayun is far more adventurous than Khosrow Shirin. Whereas adventure is present in Nizami's epic, Humayun Humayun contains black magic, kidnapping, and a double murder. At the end is happier with not only one, but 4 marriages. Speaking of happy endings, we have to look at the love concept. Where Nizami's concept of love is bound to moral issues and subdued to religious restrictions, since Khosrow is Muslim and Shirin Christian, Hojo's love concept has no moral obstacles. Barriers are set by humans, like the father of Humayun who locks his daughter up in a castle so Humayun would believe she's dead. But the love Hojo presents is also more mystic, which can be seen in the fact that the picture of Humayun is not being described. The mystic overtones also lead to a mystic moral that the epic depicts in some parts of the story. Nizami's moral issues are more strongly connected to the genre of mirrors for princes dealing with issues of kingship and governance. But there are also elements that both epics have in common. Both depict a classic love story with themes that are frequently used in Persian epics. For example, the courtly upbringing of the prince, the love-causing picture, and the meeting of the two lovers in the balcony scene, as you see in the picture. Interestingly, Haju also includes themes from other epics and interlaces them into his story, like Humay wandering in the desert like Majnun. This comparison clearly shows that Humayun is not just an imitation of Khosrow Shirin, but what does it mean for Khamsa Nivisi? With narrating a new story, Haju introduces a new tale to Persian literature instead of reworking an existing one. We can only guess its reasons. With reworking Khosrow Shirin, he would have put himself into Nizami's shadow, being unable to show off his poetical skills. Maybe it was also due to the framework of Khosrow Shirin that did not give Haju the space to tell the story and to transmit the message he wanted to. He breaks further with the tradition by choosing the mutaqarib meter for his epic instead of hazash, and by doing so, he puts his epic into a tradition of the Shahnameh and heroic poetry, and not into that of romances. Interestingly, Haju also integrates new elements in his epic, most strikingly a Sarinameh included in the foreword of his epic. Haju is the first author, by the way, to integrate an independent Sarinameh into a Masnavi, and this may have had an effect on its own in literary history. Okay, I still have some. Looking at Haju's Khamsa, and especially in Humayun, it is clear that Haju's epic is a rupture in the course of Khamsa Nivisi. Haju takes the model of Nizami and develops it into something new. With choosing new epics for his Khamsa, he loosens the content from the form and gives way to innovation. He gave the Khamsa Nivisi its flexibility that was reinterpreted 100 years later by Jamali, and maybe it opened the gates for Jami for turning his Khamsa into a Sitta and integrating a story of Salomon or Absal. Haju's epic does not build a relation between two texts, and if we want to call his epic an istiqbal, then it happens more in the term of reworking existing themes and waving them into a new framework. Maybe Jamali's Khamsa is more an istiqbal, but it was Haju who paved the way for it. But the innovations Haju made, the Sarinameh, the mystic reading, can reflect a trend in the taste of his contemporaries. Khamsa Nivisi is not just a collection, it's a dynamic. And maybe by viewing the Khamsas of this chain as fixed points and comparing the development and emphasis of the tradition's elements, we can establish new periods for Persian medieval literature. And if there is one last point we can say about Humayun, it is that the epic proves that the paradigm of decline wrong. The epic shows that even after Nizami, literary innovation took place that shaped the course of literary history. And now, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kristen. Our third presenter today, and the last one for our panel, is Layla Sayyid Qasim, who teaches at the University of Tehran. And her presentation today is entitled The Poetics of Taqdim and Ta'khir, Preposing and Postposing in Medieval Persian Prose, Bayhaqi's History as a Case Study.
I'm really happy to be here with you, thanks to Hani Rashwan and Rebecca. And I think today is very inspiring for me. I'm going to speak about a small part of my PhD dissertation. And yes, I would like to start by introducing Abul Fazl Bayhaqi, a court secretary of a number of Ghaznavid rulers in eastern Persia and Afghanistan. He has narrated 60 years of the history of Ghaznavids. Unfortunately, only 5 from at least 10 volumes of his books have survived. The rest have disappeared as a result of political changes in which most of his manuscript and notes were destroyed. However, the history is considered to be the most important source of Ghaznavid's history. The history has been translated into Arabic, Russian, and English. The English translation is a great source thanks to the contribution of English and Persian scholars. Numerous scholars, including Nazir Ahmad and Julius Scott Maysami, have written on Bayhaqi's history and praised it for its objectivity, analytical approach to reporting events, and attention to detail. But why am I investigating this script? Bayhaqi's history is also considered as one of the best pieces of Persian literary prose. The literariness of Bayhaqi's history has always been controversial. Persian medieval prose, including Bayhaqi's history, has not been rhetorically analyzed well over time because the Persian literary theory and primary sources have been merely shaped around poetry. We need to investigate how Bayhaqi's verbal message affects readers as artistic work, where the literariness of Bayhaqi comes from. A careful study of Bayhaqi's history convinced me that we cannot close our eyes on poetic of his syntactic structures. So I looked for a theorist who had a similar approach to literature, and who was better than the fellow countryman Abdul Qahir Jorjani, a Persian scholar who initiated the Arabic linguistic revolution. So I referred to Jorjani's seminal work, Dalail al-Ijaz, where he introduces the theory of Nazm and describes poetic of syntactic structures as a main notion of balagha. Based on this theory, syntax has an unknown and overlooked potential to create meaning, and Jorjani considers the syntax to be the starting point of inamability. Of course, he doesn't speak about grammatical accuracy, but various structures that lead to distinct pragmatic significations. This approach was the foundation of Ilm al-Ma'ani and later expanded in Arabic balagha by Sakkaki and Qazvini. Here you can see the main discussions addressed in Ilm al-Ma'ani and Jorjani's Dalail al-Ijaz, which I thoroughly investigated in my dissertation. In this talk, I will review my findings in first part, Taqdim and Ta'khir, preposing and postposing. These topics, as you see, are the components of a dichotomous choice system. Choosing from these dichotomies does not often change the propositional meaning of the sentence, but adds something to the implicit meaning of the sentence. Compared with 2 other branches of balagha, these topics spread very late in Persian. In 17th century, Mazandarani directly translated one of the interpretation of Talkhis al-Miftah and disregarding differences of syntactic structures between Arabic and Persian, hence being infertile. But most of the Persian source on Ilm al-Ma'ani are from the current century. The poetic of syntactic structures relies on grammar of language. So we can take headlines from Arabic, but there is a need for vernacularization in detail. And this is what the contemporary Persian theorists, rhetoricians have been attempting to do. However, it is argued that they have not come up with significant contributions due to their insufficient attention to linguistic features of Persian. In the recent century, after efforts of Muhammad Abdo in Egypt to revive the Islamic scientific thought, the novelty of Giorgiani's idea initiated a widespread quest to find the similarities of his idea with modern linguistics in theory and practice. For instance, Salwa Kamel explains some of the similarities between Giorgiani and Halliday's views by investigating information structure of Arabic language. In particular, Giorgiani's view about taqdim and ta'khir in the description stage has undeniable similarities to systemic functional linguistic, SFL, because Halliday sees language as a systemic resource for meaning or a meaning potential. Considering the speaker-writer's persona in creating discourse and the role of syntax in creating meaning and cohesion are the most important topics that interrelate Giorgiani with pragmatism and systemic functional linguistics. In particular, information structure and theme rim structure in Halliday's theory are similar to function of taqdim and ta'khir. I'm not going to explain more because it's not the main focus of this presentation. I would like to explain about my research method. I made a primary framework based on Giorgiani's view on taqdim and ta'khir and its vernacularization in Persian. I referred to linguistic studies in Persian language to make the framework more adjusted to Persian prose. In some cases, I enriched the framework by adding complementary from modern linguistics, in particular systemic functional grammar. Then I developed a part of a speech tagging scheme and annotated 3,000 clauses from Bayhaqi's history. To provide a wider view of his work, I also annotated 1,500 from Saljuqnameh of Zahiri Neishapuri, written 100 years after Bayhaqi. The annotated text was registered in an Excel spreadsheet, was subject to peer review by another PhD candidate in Persian literature. Now I'm going to divide some of findings into two categories of taqdim and ta'khir. The taqdim and ta'khir of the main and secondary sentence constituents. Before that, it is worth to say, to remind that natural word order in Persian is SOV. The unmarked sentence begins with a subject and ends with a verb. It's my, yes, it is my Excel sheet. Giorgiani and Halliday believe that deciding which part of the sentence should be preposed is the author's domain. Accordingly, the initial position of the sentence have a poetic potential. In Persian, there are two positions for emphatic element. The original position is the verb or the constituent closest to the verb, which is unmarked, and the beginning of the sentence, which is marked. As you see in the table, when the subject is specified, most of the time the sentence begins with a subject. In 20 to 25% of sentences, other elements are preposed. When the subject is omitted, verb, object, and complement are preposed more frequently. Preposing of the verb, for example, I just speak about some part of the table. Preposing of the verb mostly happens in dialogues because the dialogue by nature requires clearer and quicker information exchange. For example, in this sentence, Sultan Masood responds to Abu Nasr's message. Also in imperative verbs. Imperative verbs are preposed particularly when mixed with a strong emotion on narrators such as anger and enthusiasm. Bayhaqi also, to emphasize the significance of the object, proposes it. For instance, in this sentence, the context of situation shows that to Bayhaqi, Abu Bakr and his son are very important, so the fact that they were brought to Khaja's house as the accused is more important here than whether it was the Khalifa or someone else who had brought them. This has been particularly pronounced by the placement of raw object marker after each object. Bayhaqi also proposed the adverb to emphasize on significance of time and place. For example, in this sentence, Abu Nasr asked for an hour of Khaja's time to talk to him before Abu Bakr and his son are punished. In this critical moment, 1 hour is of great value to Abu Nasr, on which he places the emphasis. It also implies that just 1 hour is enough. Sometimes the proposing reveals the historiographical method of the historian. According to the first table, Zahiruddin postposes subject more frequently than Bayhaqi in favor of adverb or complement. More than 1/3 sentences with omitted subjects in Saljuqnameh begin with complements, which are mainly adverbs of time. They can be argued to be the thread running through Zahiruddin's sentences. Saljuqnameh resembles a daily note whose events are centered on place and time. In other words, his history has a chronological nature in that Zahiruddin attempts to record the events using precise adverbs of time. This cannot be compared to Bayhaqi's work, whose daily notes are mere raw materials for history. In contrast, the frequent use of adverbs of manner in Bayhaqi's history demonstrate his fondness for imagery and a description of events and the state of mind, which give historical accounts a fictional quality. In general, syntactic structures which are examined in Balagha can be applied to give better understanding of the structure of power and political hierarchy, which is not the focus of this presentation. About postposing or ta'khir. In Persian, any element coming after the verb is associated with ta'khir. The study of modern conversational Persian demonstrated that postposed element contain given information. The analysis of these sentences in laboratory verifies that elements moved after the verb have a falling intonation and lack any kind of prominence and any kind of emphatic function. I investigated the status and application of postposing in Bayhaqi's history. According to the table, postposing of the main elements of the sentence is insignificant at the first glance. However, the postposing of the subject and object in Bayhaqi's history is more frequent occurrence than Saljuqnameh. Bayhaqi postposes the subject when the subject interrupts the main narration. For example, in this sentence, knowing that who have moved out of Ali's way for him to pass through it, of little importance. Therefore, Bayhaqi postposes the subject over the verb to not divert the reader's attention away from what they have pursued. It brings more coherence to the text. Sometimes Bayhaqi postposes the object to restriction the subject, meaning that the action of the verb is restricted by the subject. One way of stressing the subject in Persian is to remove the space between the subject and the verb, allowing them to join. In this case, the object can be either placed after the verb or before the verb. In this sentence, for example, Bayhaqi implicitly considers that no one but God is aware of people's states of mind and soul. Therefore, object postposing does not serve an emphatic function for the object itself. As it evidenced from the table, yes. Adverbs and complements are more frequently postposed than the main elements. These two elements provide secondary and complementary information, move more frequently in the sentence, and are more easily placed after the verb. Adverbs of place are the chief preposed adverbs, particularly when accompanied with near and toward, means nazdik and janeb, or something like this. Studying the postposing of the main and secondary elements, we have so far concluded that such postposings are rarely associated with stress. This is consistent with the results of the study of modern conversational Persian. Now the question that rises is what the reason behind the frequency of postposing of secondary sentence constituents. 2 points can help answer these questions. Firstly, it is only natural for the secondary elements of sentence to have less informative significance than the main elements. Nevertheless, they can produce a significant emotional effects in the reader. These elements add to length of the sentence, reducing the speed at which primary information is conveyed. So, the overall results of such postposing can be enumerated in this way. Firstly, facilitating sentence processing. Upon reading a verb placed in the middle of the sentence, the reader subsequently understands the main information of the sentence and more readily follows its depends elements, leading to easier and quicker sentence processing. Secondly, adjusting the indicative harmony of the sentence. One side of the scale represents more important information, and other complementary and secondary information. And thirdly, creating rhythm. Since a natural pause interruption is created in the sentence after the verb, the placement of the verb in the middle of the sentence breaks it into at least two parts, creating a pause and a particular non-prosodic tone. And the post-verb position function as a kind of pedestal for secondary elements. What better option for Bayhaqi to occasionally place these elements after the verb so that they are more readily seen and heard after the pause after the verb. And in this way, he reduces I think in this way he get attention of audience better. And at the end, I would like to come back to the question at the beginning: how Bayhaqi's verbal message affects reader as artistic work. These findings indicate that taqdim and ta'khir can be considered as an influential literary device in Bayhaqi's history and in the general literary process. It can advance our understanding of literariness in the broadest sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leila. And thank you all of our panelists for being so responsible with time. We will have plenty of time for question and answers now. And I will actually begin by both inviting the panelists and the audience to perhaps probe into some of the ellipses of the presentations to give our presenters a chance to elaborate on the points that they perhaps couldn't necessarily condense into a 20-minute talk. So if the panelists have questions to each other first, I would really like to hear that, since, again, the panels are so thoughtfully organized around specific rubrics. But in either case, we will also have plenty of time to open it up to the audience for broader questions and comments.
My questions actually, I think, might facilitate that cross-presenter dialogue, because I have questions for each of you. I won't wait for each of you to respond. I thought I'll just ask them, and then if you want to respond. If not. So I'll go backwards in time. And I really enjoyed, I thought there were a lot of intersections among the presentations, which was fabulous. So to start with the last one, just the question, maybe an obvious one about prose, right? So you're using Giorgiani's theory of Nazm to analyze prose, and it would be really helpful if you could reflect on, do you see that as something that is continuous with the classical Balaka tradition? Are there precedents for using these concepts with reference to prose, or is that something that you are innovating, right? Is this a modern use of these concepts? So if you could just clarify that relationship, that would be great. As the question of epic was very interesting to me, and obviously that's a huge genre, right, in any literary tradition. You're talking about Masnavi, right, which could be translated, say, in other contexts as romance. But I remember there was a moment in your presentation when I think, if I got it right, you were saying that there were 3 qualities to the epic, the wisdom. I got a sense that you have a kind of a theory of the Persian epic that you didn't articulate, so it would be very helpful if you could just elaborate on what actually is, beyond saying it's Masnavi, what does that actually mean, and is there a meaning for that translates across, because I think we might actually have to change our understanding of epic, right, if we look at it from a Persian perspective. So if you could comment on that. And then just maybe a more sort of empirical, factual question for the first presentation. The question of Nazir, it wasn't entirely clear. I understand that Mazmun were being replicated and played with. Was that the imitative aspect, or was there also linguistic, I guess what actually was being imitated in the different ghazals? Thank you very much. A lot of questions, sorry.
Thank you, Rebecca. Who would like to start? We don't have to go necessarily in that order. Leila, would you like to start, nonetheless? Don't forget to turn on your microphone.
I don't know Arabic literature, completely Arabic theory, but the problem came from, I think, the first period when Giorgiani was writing his book. He was working on Quran, but it's a question: Quran is prose or it's a poetry? It's argumental, it's not prose, and it's not poetry. We cannot think about it. But Giorgiani, whenever he wanted to use literature, he referred to poetry, not prose, as I found in his books. And it's a tradition in Persian and Arabic literature that poetry is, it's priority for them, not prose. And in Persian, yes, totally prose. It's not. I think it's have not been investigated enough rhetorically, but sometimes they say when prose imitated poetry, yes, they try to find poetry in prose, but not. They didn't look at prose itself. And I think, yes, my work in this way is creative. Yes.
My answer is that both, actually. So, probably the attitude is that in the onset of the ghazal, you would also reference the mazmun of your model. And then, if you are sort of smart, or if it sort of comes by, then you also, obviously, at certain points, maybe at certain important points, you also try to reference, if it's possible, but more the image, obviously.
Thank you. I don't know if I can answer your question yet. Heroic wisdom and Romance poetry are the influence of the Khamsa. I don't denote an epic as a genre. I don't like saying that Humayun is a romance, because I think that we have heroic poetry elements, Western poetry elements, and romance elements in every epic. So in my thesis, I just denote them as Masnavi. I try to do that. And yes, each Masnavi contains these three elements, but there's always a shift. One Masnavi is focusing more on Western poetry, the other on heroic poetry. Maybe I can elaborate that more with in the genre discussion. But these are more influences, so I would never connect them to a genre. That's quite difficult in the course of Persian literary history.
Thank you. I thought Aida had a question.
Thank you. I have just some remarks, not question. First, this is Christian beauty. Azeri poets always glorified Christian beauty, both male and female. Fizuli glorified, depicted Tersabecha. Nasimi has Ghazal with Radif Ermeni, and Shirin is of this kind of depiction, because you say that set in Iran and Armenia. Armenia has nothing to do with Barda. Barda is a town in Azerbaijan, and if Shirin is Armenian, this is just a literary tradition, widely used literary tradition. And second, I would say that in native town Nizami Ganjabi in Ganja, people still writing Khamsa poems. And last Leyla and Majnun was written 10 years ago. So if you want, you just come to Azerbaijan and you will have so many poems. And my another point about first speaker, thank you very much for Fizuli, Saib Tabrizi and Pasha. And I just wanted to say that alongside with Persian influence, we cannot forget Arabic influence of Ibn Arabi, Ibn al-Farid, Hallaj Mansur, who used this couplet, volume poems to depict, to express their mystical feelings. And I just cannot imagine Fizuli, a poet, Turkish poet, in Iran, because Fizuli was born in Karbala. He lived during the reign of Safavid and Ottoman dynasties. His native language was Azeri Turkic. Therefore, I think we should just be more clear in these things, because how can I imagine a Fizuli Iranian poet? I cannot. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if you would like.
You're right. Our terminology in terms of ethnic and political identities should be clear. That I agree with you on. So, okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question to Leyla? Leyla, I have one question. You mentioned the Hadi Mazandarani work on Belagadas. Do you know where that was produced and which part of the 17th century?
When it's produced on 17th century, he wrote his book. When it's translation.
No, because I'm going to present on a similar work in the Ottoman context. I'm curious, is it the first half of the 17th century or the second half of the 17th century?
Oh, I'm not sure about it.
And is it really of the translation of the Talkhis, or is it the Mutawil of Taftas?
One of the interpretations of Talkhis, not Talkhis.
My second question is follow-up to Rebecca's question about the idea of, when we talk about ilm al-balagha in the Islamic context, it's usually orality and poetry, and you're working on a Bayhaqi text, which is sort of not, it's not usually, unless it's, and if I remember, because I studied it a long time ago, it's not the best exemplar of use of Saj, for example.
No, it doesn't.
No, so it seems odd that you're using Nazm as sort of a framework for discussing it rhetorically. Wouldn't it make more sense than looking at works on insha or epistolography that existed at that time? There's certainly, I'm actually going to talk about another Persian work on epistolography that was actually quite popular in Ajem. It's the Manazir al-Insha by Mahmud Gavan from the Deccan. So do you think that would be more useful to looking at a work like Bayhaqi from a rhetorical perspective, rather than looking at these very sort of classical, canonical works that do focus on poetry, ultimately? Thank you.
Yes, I'm not sure that I understood your question correctly, but I think that Bayhaqi is a very special work in Persian. At the same time, it doesn't have anything from, its language is less affected by figure of speech. For example, if you think about Golestan, yes, it's something else. But I think, yes, Nazm is concentrates on syntax structures of sentences, and Bayhaqi is very he has very a variety of structures you can see in Bayhaqi's history, and this book it's not in history field. We read it seriously in Persian literature, Yes, but I'm not sure about, you mentioned another book, Manazir.
We use sort of Nazm, but with works on Insha, for example, I just cite one example from the end of the 15th century, which is Manazir al-Insha, that was produced in the Deccan under the Bahami sultans. But there are other works on Tarassul that I don't know if that would be more useful as a way to think about prose texts. Because what I find interesting is that all three presenters talked about particular forms, as Rebecca mentioned. And I'm not sure whether Mesnevi fits into discussions of Belagat, because actually it's elided by at least Ottoman writers on Belagat, because it's part narrative and part poetry. But it's hard. I don't know how. I'm having a hard time putting my head around Bayhaqi's text as a way to talk about Belagat, because it's not really wonderful Persian in the more traditional sense that it evolves into. I mean, it's Persian that modern scholars can appreciate as sort of evolution of language, but it's not really it's not ornate prose, ultimately. So that's why I'm like, is it better to compare it from on the framework that allows how it fits into sort of traditional categories of epistolography or letter writing as a way to think about the text, because it's unusual, right? I mean, it's not, when I think about rhetorically refined prose texts, I think of Saj in a certain period for Persian, right? You can talk about the Golestan, but there are also historical writing by that appear in the Timurid period in particular. Zafernameh is a good example of sort of very rhetorically rich language. So part of it's just thinking out loud, but thinking about whether it's more useful to thinking about sort of history or chronicles and how to approach them. Is it better to approach them by looking at sort of traditional definition of rhetoric, or is it better to think about using works that come from Insha? Because
at the same time, yes, I think I know that many scholars work on Bayhaqi from, for example, narrations. It's narrations. Bayhaqi is very good, a storyteller. It's unique to himself. His way of storytelling is unique to himself, but it's just part of a wider story, I think. You know, my study, my findings, I think showed that it's poetic of syntactic structure is it's worthy to study in Bayhaqi's, especially in Bayhaqi's history, and because it's influenced in modern prose in Persian. You know, for example, even in Shamlu, Ahmad Shamlu, precisely, I think that he worked on Bayhaqi, and it's very effective for, reading Bayhaqi is very effective for modern poems.
Because it's, yes, very effective. When the read is not, something else should be changed in text.
To the literature, and it is syntactic structures, I think.
I want to take Murad's question, but I just wanted to follow up on this challenge that Suyong is proposing, and I want to somehow counter it as well, because I think the material that we are dealing with, and all three presentations, I think, provided plenty of examples of that, don't really give way to, I think, very facile distinctions of beautiful and functional, or prose and poetry. And I don't want to already in this, charged title, post-Eurocentric poetics, use Eurocentric as an epithet, but I would at least want to reiterate that these sorts of binary distinctions, to my mind at least, belong to a modernist mindset, right? The idea that, for example, that nazm is a category of thinking or composition that belongs exclusively to poetry, I think would be a ridiculous proposition to anyone working within these spheres. Because once again, we are not talking about modernist poets who are just producing the latest volume and reading that to their audiences like rock stars or something. Whenever you encounter poetry in this discursive world, and whenever it's textualized, as Rebecca was proposing, it's always not only surrounded by prose, but it's inflected by it, it's propped up by it, it's in antagonism to it. That relationship, I think, cannot be easily reduced to the Hegelian aesthetic categories of the Rangstreit of poetry and prose, at the end of which we raise to the modernist self-consciousness of being able to describe in rational and precise terms, in prosaic sentences, the everyday world that we also inhabit and in which we inscribe our history as human beings. I don't know what that was, but let's leave it hanging for a moment.
I agree with you. We should stick to a binary. Heidegger also says that there is a tradition that deals with prose.
That's very distinct. So and also to historicize it properly. That's all. So I agree that you can use. It is really about nazm as the sort of ultimate framework for all of these things. But at least for the period I work on, the early modern period, there are proliferations of Belagat texts that focus on prose writing, and you can't ignore them. That's all.
I just have one very quick empirical point. It's not a question. Just to kind of one way I would, if I was to go deeper into your debate, it's just interesting to look at what was actually cited in these rhetorical manuals as examples of beauty, right? And off the top of my head, I don't know if Bayhaqi was cited, but what I'm struck by thinking about this is the text I was referencing, Shamsakay's and so on, although it's a bit early, they don't reference Insha literature as an example of exemplary. Now, maybe later Balakha texts do, but actually I don't think in terms of citations, it's ornate language is not it's not the only object of interest for the major text of Balagha. Okay, I'll pass it on.
Murad, maybe you would like to ask your question?
Thank you. I really enjoyed all of the presentations, and I have a question for Ferenc, someone interested in imitation and appropriation within the early modern context. I found your presentation particularly inspiring, and it was nice to see the ways in which Saib actually appropriated Fuzuli's poetry and came up with a response. So what I'm wondering is, does Saib in anywhere throughout his poetry collection, does he come out and say what he thinks about imitation, or why he imitates the work of predecessor poets, or the contemporaries of Saib, do they, literary scholars, tezkira writers, or other scholars coming from other disciplines, do they comment on Saib's intertextual dialogue with Fuzuli or other poets? So this is, I want to see like if there are some reflections, on the process of imitation, how they interpret that textual engagement. Do we have any data, that kind of information?
I can't give you a straight answer because I haven't looked at how Saib's Persian poetry is being discussed by contemporaries. What I can say is this: that Saib was obsessed actually with imitation. I mean, really a large chunk of his work is made up of naziras, and multiple naziras, and reworking the same theme in multiple ways. Again, as far as his Turkish poetry is concerned, nothing. Because it was so small, actually. I mean, in the case of Wahid Khazvini, it's somewhat larger, but it was really, I mean, in the case of these poems, particularly in terms of their Tazegui poetry, it's actually limited.
Okay, but the reason I'm asking, because as far as I remember, Fuzuli, in his preface to his Turkish divan, probably he has 3 different compilations. He talks about how he envies and how he's jealous of the Rumi poets, the poets based in Istanbul, gathered around Suleiman's court, and how he, passionately wants to imitate their poetry. So here, I think, like in Fuzuli's case, the primary motivation for writing, in the style of the Rumi poets is, seeking patronage and, getting in contact with Hayali Bey, for example, or Baki, the big names in 16th century Istanbul. I understand that, but there's also this, he also mentions the fact that, well, the Rumi style is now is now famous and is getting more attention from the court, and something is being created in Istanbul, and he's very aware of that fact. So I was wondering, like in the case of Saib or other Persian poets around his time, do we have that? Similar dynamics, or I don't know, but yeah, that would be. Interesting. What was his motivation? Even if he doesn't, come out and say, do we have any anecdotal references or biographical information or remarks in the tezkires or anyway, yeah.
Well, not everyone was a Tazegui poet,
Yeah.
but sort of Tazegui was sort of the cutting edge.
Right.
And Saeb was a very much self-conscious
Yeah.
in that. I mean, he was, on the one hand, he was the Malik al-Shu'ara,
Right.
right? And on the other hand, he was actually pretty wealthy.
Yeah.
So he was quite independent and could actually make sure that his poetry was properly spread, distributed, and copied and distributed.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why we have actually a pretty steady paper trail in terms of Saeb copies.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's
Yeah.
an answer to your question.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to say something, but I'm not sure it is related to your question or not. In general, in Persian literature, imitating is, it was so natural for them. It's not even a question, because, for example, Hafiz say that love is one thing, it's one special thing, but whenever I hear about love, it is something new. It seems something new. So he himself, he has. Because I was working on between Hafiz and Saadi. They have 50 ghazals in common. Is istiqbal between them. And if you work about Khaja, it's terrible. You don't believe that. They Hafiz and Khaja, they have a lot of ghazals in common, and they are famous by Hafiz. Nobody knows Khaja these days in Iran because it's a big person, and Khaja is disappeared.
Yeah.
In public. And I think, yes, this tradition was very natural in Iran, because we have a large amount of Persian literature is produced as a result of imitation,
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or Fariel?
I have a question, sorry. I have a question to Leila, which is a follow-up to the question that was raised about using the use of Giorgiani's theory. And I think you did justify it when you talked about structural linguistics and pragmatism, and you kind of drew some parallel with modern linguistics. And I'd like to hear more about that, and if you can elaborate why you made this link, and how does it help you in reading Bayhaqi's history. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
As I mentioned, Giorgiani and Holiday, they have many ideas in common. And why it was useful for me, because I think it was, because it's not a coherent, theory. When you worked on Giorgiani, you have to be careful. You have to extract, you have to read whole the book. You have to, when you want to think about one sentence of Giorgiani, you have to, at the same time, you have to think about other sentence, because he was not a modern theorist with, this is, headlines, and you have to, you yourself have to extract, to create this cohesion. And sometimes, there was some gaps for me. There was some gaps. To fill these gaps, I refer to Halliday's, not more. I didn't apply in my MA thesis was related, but based on Halliday. But I found it useless at the end, because I think I couldn't find many things in the text when I applied Halliday's method in the Persian modern text. I couldn't find. I think I couldn't contribute a lot. So I think that I need Giorgiani, and sometimes I need to fill its blank, its gaps with Holidays or somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions, comments? Okay, please join me in thanking our panelists.